Irashaimase! Hello and welcome to Fataris' Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fataris. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this week we have Orius, a 1991 Konami arcade classic. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. From publisher Konami, Orius, or Xexex as it was known outside of the North American region, was released to arcades in 1991. This title definitely feels like a culmination of Konami's shoot-'em-up skill up to the point this title was released. And in addition to having the Konami DNA, it also takes the ideas from other shoot-'em-ups and combines them with this title, specifically IREM. This title really feels like a combination between Gradius and the R-Type series, and, well, if that's something that sounds interesting to you, it's one that I could recommend based off of that. Also, if you're a fan of horizontal scrolling shoot-'em-ups from the era, that's also a very strong point in this title's favor. But one thing to note, it is actually a fairly difficult shoot-'em-up, so do be ready for a challenge. So this was a title I wasn't very familiar with before this Arcade Archive release, and I'm really glad to have this experience with the game itself. So here we find ourselves at the Arcade Archive title screen, and you can see there are three versions available. There's the original Japanese version, and this version is actually substantially different from the other two. The European version and the North American version are, for the most part, similar. It's really just the title screen that's different between them. So first off, we're going to look at the Japanese version, and then we'll take a look at the North American version to see the differences between them. Starting the game, we do have the usual nice control scheme laid out for us by Hamster, although you can customize your controls, and I usually do, adding in the rapid fire and moving around the buttons if I feel necessary. The game itself has a really nice presentation. If we let things run initially, you'll see some really neat, like, pre-rendered 3D being manipulated by the game itself. But we're going to just jump past that and throw some credits in the machine. And we get these nice little anime cutscenes throughout the course of the game with some really well done voice lines. Although the voice lines are relatively short, it's neat that they included this kind of storytelling in this title. Starting the game, so one different to note right off the bat is in the English version you have the stage names, whereas in the Japanese version it says charge the enemy. So as you can see here, this for one thing, the background is rather trippy, but it's like really impressive for the era. The gameplay itself, it almost looks like we're flying an R-type ship, as we have a ship with holding like a almost like biological organism in front of it. As far as the gameplay mechanics are concerned, it's actually fairly straightforward. We have our main shot, which in the Japanese version, you start with the one, like your standard shot, and then you can power it up to, or change it with different power-ups to 6 other types of weapons. In addition to those weapons, we have the flint, which is basically this game's version of the R-Type Force. And that can be released from the ship. If you just press the flint button, then it just releases it. But it is possible also, when the flint is attached to your ship, to charge it up. If you just release the charge button with your shot, it fires this awesome tentacle, electrical tentacle attack at the enemies that deals quite a bit of damage. However, if you charge it up and then press the flint button in the Japanese version, it fires the flint forward, dealing also a fair bit of damage and placing it further ahead. Once again, very similar to R-Type in that design. So the game itself, as I mentioned, the Japanese version has 6 different weapons, and then the weapon will always be displayed in the bottom right of the screen. So now we have the ground laser, and there are other power-ups we can get as well. So this golden power-up here increases the strength of, or one way to look at it is you could go and say that it's evolving our and flint. So instead of like being level 1 and having just a single tentacle, it now has 2. And it's possible to power that up to a total of 3 tentacles. In addition to that, the charge shot has additional tentacles in that electrical charge attack, which is a really neat graphical effect. So we find ourselves almost at the end of the first stage, and things are a little bit normal from a graphical standpoint here compared to the rest of the first stage. But we do encounter our first boss. So this boss has a couple stages to this fight where we get this one enemy, and if we destroy these kind of brain-like cells, then we'll destroy both of them. Let's pick up this other weapon. So this is the spiral laser, which is a really fun weapon to use in this game. But now we get some really neat graphical flair where the game takes the 2 enemy ships and morphs the enemy sprites up into this new enemy that combines the 2 ships we saw with this additional cannon. It's not very effective though, as we can actually shoot down those cannon shots, and after a quick fight, we're done here. So that is basically the Japanese version, so let's switch over real quick to the international version. So, as I was noting, you can see right there that there's that first difference where the Japanese version would have said charge the enemy, whereas in the international version we have the planet name Planet Dis. And also, right off the bat, one thing you might notice that's different is that the game is now 2-player. So that's one big difference between the Japanese version and the international version. The international version added the ability to play the game as a second player. Unfortunately, it's not optimized. So you're going to encounter significantly more slowdown with a second player than you would without, but in a lot of ways I feel it does make it worth it to play with another player. It's just nice having that extra bit of firepower to help control the enemies throughout the course of the game. So that's the first major difference between the international version and the Japanese version. So another thing I want to go and note before we talk about the versions is just how neat this stage is. So this kind of seems like a really interesting a take on just looking at things as if they were all molecules done in a shoot 'em up. And once again, when you consider the time this title released, this stage is actually very impressive, even if once again it doesn't feel that it's super optimized. So a big difference that exists between the Japanese version and the international version is the Japanese version used a life system, and indeed you saw me lose a life, and there's a neat animation that's associated with that, as when you come back from having lost a life, you actually, it's like the ship gets recombined together from having been blown up. But in the international version, we have life bars instead of lives, and when you die, you aren't set back to a checkpoint, rather you just continue right where you're left off, and that holds true for continuing the game as well. But there are some negative changes in addition to that, which I feel was a positive change. One of the big negatives is they took out all the additional weapons. So instead of having 7 different weapons, including our base weapon, like the Japanese version has, the international release, we just have the base laser or the photon cannon itself, but there are power-ups to power it up several levels. So as you power it up, you get more shots and that fan out in a spread. In addition, it's also possible to collect missiles, and those missiles will do a light bit of homing in on the enemies, but it doesn't make up for having all those different kinds of neat lasers that they used in the Japanese version of the title. So in addition to those, in the international version, with playing with 2 players, so you can see here we have a fully powered up Flint with the 3 tentacles. But when you're playing with 2 players, there's a limit to the number of tentacles you can have on screen. Between the 2 players, you can only have a maximum of 4 tentacles between you. A really weird limitation. And I feel like the difficulty was also tweaked for the international version. Not just for 2-player, but also... so here we have our villain, like Lord Klaus Pachelbel. It's just a bad guy that you don't want to go and like mess with a punk like that. Let's see if I can get that life. So, as I was mentioning, there's just some like weird limitations with your count of tentacles between the games, but another thing, I felt like the difficulty was tweaked for the international version. So the bosses are relatively weak in terms of HP in the Japanese version when you're comparing the same difficulty levels anyway. The difficulty does scale quite a bit in the or rather the options to scale the difficulty are like quite substantial in the settings, but even then, on an easier difficulty setting, the game is still blisteringly hard, starting from this stage on, really. But the one thing that's significantly different between the Japanese and the international version is the life or the HP of the bosses. So even on on the same difficulties, the bosses will go down significantly easier on the the Japanese version than the international version. They're significantly tankier in the international version, to the point of almost being frustratingly long of a boss fight. But unlike the Japanese version, if you die in the boss fight, you're not going to be set back to a checkpoint. So I guess that's the trade-off. This stage itself, though, is one of the ones that I really appreciate from just the aesthetic sense. So we have that really neat pink planet rolling around in the background with a ring around it, and there's some really neat water effects as well. So the waterfalls, if you happen to pass your ship between them, you break the waterfalls, and you also have the neat little splash effect when you enter in the water, regardless of if it's from above or below. Indeed, this stage kind of felt like they're almost like taking something like more mythological and adding that to the game itself. And you'll see why I say mythological when we get to the boss here in just a moment. At any rate, that kind of sums up both Orius or Xexex, both the international and the Japanese version. And overall, I gotta say that this is a title that I definitely appreciate, though the difficulty can get a bit frustrating. So here we find ourselves facing off against the boss of Stage 3, which is this mythical dragon, but with those weird beads or brain, I don't know what the heck you want to go and call it, that you go and find on most of the enemies throughout the course of the game. Once again, this fight goes pretty quickly in the Japanese version, but is kind of a slog on the international version. There's also some really weird momentum things going on in the couple stages that have a vertical scrolling. So this one we could scroll the stage up and down, and that's still happening with the boss, but it just makes it feel like we're actually getting tugged around. It's not a pleasant experience, and that happens throughout the course of this stage and the other one that uses the same kind of scrolling. So as far as minus flavors are concerned, one thing that does really frustrate me about the title is just how the difficulty was kind of tweaked with the international version. So you've got the bosses being significantly tankier, as well as the stages themselves seemingly more difficult, although I can't say that for certain, as the Japanese version is more difficult due to the checkpoint, and I haven't made it as far on the Japanese version as they have on the international version. Also, it would have been nice if the two-player mode was a little more optimized, so there wasn't quite as much slowdown. But like there are definitely development limitations with that, so that is understandable. And then lastly, just that weird, as far as minus flavors, just that weird scrolling issue that you have when playing the game, when playing the stages where you can scroll vertically. This one, where there's not as much of that vertical scrolling, it's not as noticeable, so that's something to keep in mind. But as far as the plus flavors are concerned, I love specifically the graphics in this title, both how vibrant and colorful everything is, the designs of the enemies itself, the variants you have there, the awesome design of the ships, the awesome designs of the bosses, and just how awesome it looks for what would have been the 16-bit era of gaming. Sadly, this title didn't really see ports to much outside of up to this point, outside of PlayStation Portable port. It was included as part of the Salamander Portable collection that released in 2007. So really, this has been our first opportunity since then to play this title, and the first time to play it on a more dedicated home console like the Switch or the PlayStation 4. So, there you have it. Orius served up for your enjoyment. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for joining us this week. Not just this week, but also this year, as this wraps up, well, actually, this will be our first episode for the year 2022, and let's hope it's an awesome one. We've had a ton of great shoot 'em ups in 2021, and I only hope that continues into 2022. Anyway, Happy New Year. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful new year, and we'll see you next week.